You know, I'm so old that I remember when I was growing up that the United Nations, I was taught, was a force for good, a way to spread universal values, good values to the rest of the world. Boy, have I got smarter. Or maybe the UN just got a lot more corrupt, more in the pocket of the nastiest regimes on the planet, not the best. And the latest evidence is this. The United Nations Economic and Social Council. Last week, they held an election of the 54 member countries, including Australia. The vote was to decide who would be on the UN's top body for women's rights, which countries should be members of its Commission on the Status of Women. Unbelievable. No fewer than 43 of those 54 countries, 43 of them said, you know, we think Iran should be on that women's body. This is not a joke. Fascist Iran, Islamist Iran, is now on that Commission on the Status of Women, along with China, sitting in judgment on women's rights in Australia. Joining me, as always on a Monday, is Brendan ONeill, editor of the online magazine Spike. Brendan, this is not a joke. It is deadly serious. Your reaction?
Well, it feels like a joke. It feels like a sick joke, actually, to have Iran on a UN Women's Rights Committee. You know, Iran, this is a country in which women have to wear the hijab. Recently, 3 women were imprisoned for 30 years between them for refusing to wear the hijab and organising protests against it. The Iranian regime accused them of encouraging prostitution simply for expressing their freedom. And recently, Iran was found to come number 140 out of 144 countries in terms of gender parity. It has a very small female workforce. There are a very small number of female politicians. This is a country that oppresses women. This is a country that treats women as second-class citizens. The idea that it should be on a committee for women's rights and gender equality is just absolutely perverse.
How do you think this sort of thing happens?
Well, that's the big question. I think one thing is that Iran is a powerful country. It is regionally very powerful and getting more powerful as a result of the events of the past 20 years. It's very powerful now in Iraq. It's very influential in Syria. It's close to Russia. It's becoming a huge regional power. So it wields influence, no doubt, on smaller countries and probably puts pressure on them to pursue a certain course at the United Nations. So Iran is very powerful, and also the UN has become a bit of a ridiculous body. I mean, the UN, who could possibly take the United Nations seriously? It's always doing stupid things like this. I think it's actually time for us not only to have a reckoning with Iran and to call it out for being a misogynistic regime, but also to ask questions about what the UN is for today and why it keeps doing ridiculous things like this.
So true, and let's not even overlook China being on this Status for Women Commission, even though it's accused credibly of forcible sterilisation of Muslim Uyghur women in China. I mean, what a sick joke. Now, here's another question that's really puzzling me, or maybe it's not that surprising. Why has President Joe Biden of the US or his administration not said a thing about this sick joke of Iran being on the Commission for the Status of Women?
I was thinking the same thing myself, and I really am struggling to work out what's going on here. I think the Biden administration wants to repair relations with Iran. It certainly wants to be seen to be different to Trump in terms of how it deals with Iran. It's interested in the Iranian nuclear deal and resuscitating some of those old ways of dealing with Iran, and it probably doesn't want to rock the boat. Another part of me wonders if, you know, we know that the Biden administration is going to be a woke administration. It buys into all the woke nonsense. It's incredibly politically correct. And I'm wondering if some people in the Biden administration might think it would be a bit Islamophobic to criticize Iran and to judge it for having supposedly different cultural values to our own. I wouldn't be surprised by that either. I think it's a combination of America, the current administration in America, wanting to prove that it is different to what went before, and also an element of political cowardice, which means that Biden can't even raise questions about something as insane as this.
Oh, I suspect you may be right. Don't forget that He was Vice President of Barack Obama, whose first big overseas tour as president was an apology tour to the Arab world. I do think in that Democrat Party there's a great strain of almost shame for Western civilization, fear of seeming to be lecturing anyone at all, including Iran. 4 democracies voted for this, I must say. We don't know which, but they did as well. Now, Brendan, there is a theme to tonight's show earlier, and this as well, the demonisation of the West and the white, while meanwhile our elite turns a blind eye to the sins of anyone else. Now, in Britain, up the road from you, the University of Sheffield is considering new moves to, it says, decolonise its curriculum to make more students from allegedly marginalised communities feel more included, more represented. And one proposed move is to teach engineering students that Sir Isaac Newton, the great pioneering scientist, some say perhaps one of the greatest in the world that the world's ever seen, the 17th century genius who first formulated the laws of gravity and motion and helped to really kickstart the scientific revolution, was actually a bad guy who benefited from colonialism because it held shares in the South Sea Company, which traded in slaves. Is this sort of teaching necessary, Brendan, to produce better engineers for the world?
Absolutely not. And in fact, I think it's very, very counterproductive. You know, as you say, Isaac Newton is one of the greatest Britons of all time. He laid the foundations for modern science with his theory of gravity. His contribution to our understanding of the world just cannot be overstated. I mean, it is just absolutely immense. And now he's being taught, people at Sheffield are potentially going to be taught that he was a bad guy because he benefited from some forms of colonialism. This is absolutely ridiculous. And it really follows a pattern. You know, this so-called decolonization movement where some student radicals and university administrators want to kind of cast aspersions on figures from history. It really is about distancing ourselves from the great traditions of the West, from Western Enlightenment values, from the leaps forward made by people like Newton or Darwin. You know, the Natural History Museum in London has considered distancing itself from Darwin because he went on colonial ships as he was exploring the world. It's this shame about Britain's past, which I think people are finding very irritating and incredibly regressive.
And also, I think, to sort of treats the students as the black students as fools. Like you know, they won't pay any attention to. You know, they won't respond to Isaac Newton's laws of gravity and all this kind of stuff, and you know, scientific endeavour, if they don't know that he was also maybe in favour of slavery. Maybe we don't even know that, but maybe. And otherwise, they're not interested. I don't get it. Or maybe they think, hey, the bridge you built fell down because you didn't allow for the laws of gravity. And they say, well, listen, I wouldn't listen to anything told to me by a man who invested in the South Sea Company. I mean, it's a joke.
It's ridiculous. And actually, that's a really important point because these people pose as anti-racists, but there's a racist component to this. This idea that ethnic minority students can't really appreciate the wonders of Isaac Newton's work because of claims that he was linked with colonial forms of trade, or this idea that they're not really cut out for dead white European males, you know, too much Shakespeare, too much Charles Dickens. They really need authors and works that speak to them as black people or Asian people or whatever else it might be. There's a racism to that. It's this idea that these students, who most of whom are incredibly bright, cannot really link with anything that's too white or too Western or too British. And what it actually says is that those students don't really belong in this country as much as white students do and cannot connect with this country's history. That, I think, is a really poisonous argument. And I would trust all students, regardless of their background, to be able to understand the great leaps forward made by people like Newton.
Well, if they can't, then they shouldn't be studying there in the first place, I think. Brendan ONeill, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.